audience needs no introduction. Sandy Stadtfeld, who has done a lot of work on history related to St. Mary's, as well as other historical kinds of things. So I don't think you need any other introduction. They can just give you an applause as well.
Thank you for making the expectations reasonable. The whole theme of our summer series this year has been, or is, who we are, essentially looking at what we are as a community and what we are as an organization and as a faith organization. And what I've been looking at is essentially who we've been, and who we've been over the lifetime of St. Mary's from 1891, well, 1888, actually, when things really got going here in Cow Hollow. And suffice to say that we've been here before. We've been here many, many times, and things have never, ever been easy for us. So it's really fun. We have some references that are really available that everybody's familiar with, what we call the Blue Book, the Cow Hollow Church. This was written by Reverend Keppel Hill, the third longest serving rector at St. Mary's back, and he served through 1966. And we kind of hold this up as a reference for, you know, the authoritative last word about what was going on prior to his term and during his term. But he really kind of glosses over a lot of things that might have been offensive to certain families at the time that he wrote the book, or that are just a little embarrassing about what it takes to keep a church community going. Still, it's a good window into things, but if you really want to get the dirt, it's back in this closet. And there are a series of beautifully organized and filed boxes, thanks to Parishioner Mary Morganti and Pat Lucy, and probably some others. Ellen, I'm sure you have.
No, I just read them.
You just read them anyway. Full of, just rich with great information, not just about the business of the church and you know, what the organization is doing from day to day or from year to year and month to month, but just terrific pictures of who we are and what motivates individual parishioners, the diocese, the clergy, to keep a place like this going. As I said, it's never been easy. And we actually have been hanging by a thread much longer over, you know, as a proportion of our time, hanging by a thread much longer than we've been financially stable, physically together, or staffed, or attended as a real, you know, strong parish church. So rather than give a kind of a chronologic look at how we've come through all of this, I was just sort of going like you would if you were going through your parents' scrapbook, finding really cool stuff and pulling it out and saying, this is a good one, you know. So I have a few of those here to try and illustrate just how through all of the challenges that we faced, there have been individuals that had tremendous faith in what this place would be someday. Not in, you know, making it what it is or reinforcing that, but thinking, you know, in 20, 30 years, this is what we could become. And it seems to me that we're sort of still doing that in a lot of respects. There are always places where we're just not quite there, or not fulfilling what we think our mission is. So those individuals emerge time and time again, and they're not necessarily who you think. It's not always, you know, great benefactors. It's not people with big names or great sums of money to spend. They're people who just have that kind of faith and fulfill it. But I'd like to go back first to Frank and Amelia Pixley, who we kind of have treated as really generous, thoughtful people. Essentially what they did was they saddled us with a swamp and in this property. It was well known to people in the neighborhood and to the Pixleys who had the dry land across Steiner Street, an entire block on which they lived in their estate, surrounded by trees. Across the street was a property, this kind of marshy little place with 3 known seeps running through it, and it was never dry. So when this guy, William Bolton, our first rector, went to meet with Frank Pixley, Pixley said, sure, you can have the place across the street. Bolton, I'm not sure he actually, certainly didn't you know, have a hydrologist come look at the place. He said, fine, we'll do it. And they went ahead and built a wood frame structure straight on top of this marshy land. And we've been paying for that ever since. Honest to gosh, it's by by 1920, they have a huge termite problem. Things are subsiding. The walls are wicking moisture up into the structure. There's dry rot everywhere. They take care of it in the early 1920s. Then by early 1940s, the same thing is happening. So there's been this series of, we look at it like thoughtful building programs, but most of it's remedial. We spent easily 3 or 4 major building programs punctuated in between by little things that just needed to get fixed before they fell over. So that, while we think of the whole property here as a tremendous gift, it's been kind of an albatross to us. And the fact that we still have the same building and it's a nice place to be, that people feel safe going there, they didn't always. There were times when we lost parishioners because they felt that the place was going to fall down. The fact that we've survived with that kind of a plant is pretty remarkable. And there's always been a building committee, somebody who was thinking about what do we need to do to fix this place up. And those things have all come to pass. So again, thank you, Frank and Amelia.
We did get the nice picture up.
We got the nice picture, against Amelia's wishes. That was the one thing she wanted to hold on to. And apparently that resulted in quite a violent argument between Frank and Amelia Pixley to let us have that painting. So the one over the altar, it's a copy of something from the...
My opinion's
Well, that's another story. There's more to that as well. We have, Ellen graciously shared with me a list of, essentially financial bequests that have been made over the years, and it's sort of descriptive, but it's really a matter of, what we've decided to do with that money and how we've executed against some of those bequests. But there was a real problem at one time here at St. Mary's that people tended to give the church things, and beautiful things, priceless heirlooms, or things done by a local artist that they thought were just going to be great. And what we look at now as, this quaint, dark, beautiful wooden church, Victorian church here at Union and Steiner, really winds up being kind of a collection of kind of cheesy things that people donated. And there's a whole list of those, too. All through mainly in the 1930s and 40s. This is when we were still going through the age of short tenured rectors, when nobody served longer than 3 years. And they couldn't hold on to it all. And during that period, I think by 1920, we had reverted to mission status. And again, this place, so as I said, this place was hanging by a thread. And yet there were probably 50, 60 regular communicants who were here holding the fort down and doing what needed to do to keep it together. As I said earlier, it's not, at that period, it's not really about the big benefactors or the influential people, but the people who are paying off the mortgage on the church is the women's auxiliary, holding bake sales and bazaars. If you go through the financial records, you see that, there are various and sundry gifts that help pay the rector's salary, for example, or we're getting subsidized by the diocese. But when it comes to the financial reports at the end of the year, when they're making progress on paying off the mortgage, it's bake sales and bazaars. They're doing it. And they don't get anywhere near enough thanks, but it's as if, the Daughters of the King were, having a bake sale out here every weekend, and that was what kept us afloat. And it was quite a triumph to pay off the mortgage. This was after, so I'm jumping around a little bit. Another thing that the Pixleys saddled us with was this deed of gift that said that this place had to be the highest of high church, according to the Oxford movement in England, where robes and incense, and just everything was really grand. It was a very unpopular position at the time when it was, there was sort of a nationalism afoot in the land here around 1900, and that to be an Anglo-Catholic on those terms was not only to be English, which was suspicious, but to be sort of popish as well. And so the place really elicited a lot of suspicion and a lot of criticism in the press. But by 1920, we were able to renegotiate that deed of gift and get out from under that requirement. It was pretty pretty onerous. The other thing, though, I found out that enabled us to do that was that one of the, I think it was Herbert Parrish, was about the fourth rector here, was a big proponent of the Oxford movement. He worked here for about 3 years and then got a better offer from Church of the Advent and took all of those practices over there with him and found a much more supportive congregation there, and that church became sort of the center of high church worship amongst Episcopal parishes. The bishop at the time said, great, let them take care of that. And we were released from that expectation. So at that point, St. Mary's becomes less of a high church institution and more conventional in its worship. And I believe, doesn't Advent, don't they carry on to this day? If you've never been to a service at Church of the Advent,
Like the liturgical rockets.
I was like the canopy over the procession. Anyway, so again, sort of fortuitously, we become unburdened by some things that make it very difficult for this church to thrive here in Cow Hollow. Underlying all of this is just what sort of place Cow Hollow is. Cow Hollow was originally sort of a half working class, half upper class community until maybe the 1930s, when things start to fill in and it becomes more of the neighborhood that we see today. I think the rectors that came in here really misunderstood what kind of neighborhood they were in. They thought it was going to be just like any other town where they could build a congregation and get people coming in. It's not until when Keppel Hill starts in his job in the late 1940s, he writes in the book, in fact, this is just not that kind of place. People come here and they go, they don't live here very long. Keppel Hill was a guy who was interested in visiting people, knocking on doors of his parishioners, he served in Oklahoma and Salinas for a while, small town churches, where he considered himself a visiting rector. And he commented on, by the 8th or 9th door that he knocked on, he knew he wasn't welcome anymore. To just wait for people to invite him to dinner, that method of reaching out to the congregation wasn't going to work in Cow Hollow. But it takes us 50 some odd years to figure that out, just what kind of place this is. And I believe we still are kind of wrestling with that. How do you engage the neighborhood and the life of the parish and what we do here? So there are a couple of turning points in our history, and a lot of them, again, don't come out in Keppel Hill's book. And there's from some unlikely people. One of them is this guy, Bayard Jones, who was a rector here he was a vicar here for 3 years before the time that we got reinstated as a full-on parish. Bayard Jones followed Henry Olaf, who was the vicar here for, I think, 13 years, but was kind of, he mailed it in. He was more interested in the Canon Kip Center downtown. He was more interested in social justice things than in actually building a congregation here. So during his 13 years, we never had more than 100 regular communicants in the congregation. It's not great development work. And then he ultimately resigned when the bishop couldn't afford to keep paying him his salary. And the bishop was ready to say, you guys take care of this. It was clear that Henry Olaf wasn't going to get compensated the way he expected. So in those days, it turns out the bishop sort of went out and found candidates and suggested them. The vestry, there wasn't like a search committee that went out. We weren't really in charge of finding or selecting who would be the next person. In fact, some rectors found out that they were being considered for the position without their knowledge. And they would get an offer out of the blue to come work at a place like this. In fact, this is how Keppel Hill was recruited. They had to send a deputation down to Salinas where he was preaching to sell him on the idea of coming here. In any event, 1938, this guy, Bayard Jones, is serving in Reno, Nevada as the rector of the church. And he is contacted by the vestry here. I'll read you a little bit of this. Just a hilarious letter. Dear brethren, thank you for your letter of yesterday. No doubt I'm to blame for not discussing the question of parochial finance with you when I saw you. However, the whole circumstances were a little embarrassing. I came before you as a total stranger whom you've never heard of, who was in the position of being wished upon you by the authority. without any chance of your choosing or refusing. Primarily, I wanted to talk about the task to be done, not how much I was likely to get out of it. I was not anxious to stress the fact that I was taking longer chances than you were, especially financially, because after all, the bishop knows well what a given person can do without being to prophesy what a given church can pay in the future. Besides, your financial setup in 1934 was known to me. I'd looked you up in the 1935 Journal of the Diocese of California. And the bishop was very positive in his assurances that for the immediate present, there was no doubt about your being able to somehow or other continue to pay you what you paid your last vicar. It looked very simple. You had a healthy Easter offering, and you would have 3 months of light expenses, even if diminished receipts. There ought to be no trouble about your managing the established scale for the 5 months to the end of the year. Then this fall, there ought to be a normal, systematic, every-member canvass, such as every normal vestry undertakes every year. And this, if intelligently directed and diligently prosecuted, ought to take all the strain out of your situation for 1937. Of course, what neither the bishop nor I knew was that you were considerably in arrears for previous salary and had to catch up. That is a real complication, without, however, affecting the general estimate of the situation I had made in the beginning. Of course, I knew perfectly that your $1,500 for building fund was not a parochial surplus and could not be touched for any other purpose. I mentioned it to you as a healthy symptom of capacity and willingness. Also, from previous observation and experience, I recognize the frame of mind you're in as being something that every vestry undergoes after the resignation of your rector. They know that revenues are bound to fall off during the interregnum until they get another person, and that it is possible that some form of support may be held up while personal adherents of the previous rector are making up their minds how much they like his successor. He goes on. Anyway, the guy, he didn't sound like somebody we'd want to hire. So there were plenty of other outreach, plenty of other candidates at that time. None of them took the job. In fact, Bayard Jones is prescient about that. He says, launching out at your own initiative as an independent parish, like yourselves, they must speedily find out that there's a limited choice in cut-price clergymen. Yeah, they can get a very young and almost wholly inexperienced or untried man, or they can take their pick of people with a long and imposing list of parochial failures. To be able to make their own selection and secure a good man, contentedly doing a good work where he is, they ordinarily have to offer him more than he is getting to induce him to move. In other words, they must pay the prevailing scale, perhaps with a premium. I know my vestry at Watsonville hunted around for 6 months after I left, turning down applications of most of the failures on the West Coast. Anyway. It doesn't, as I say, we've been here before, and we're probably better off than we've been in the past in terms of our ability to make these kinds of selections. And we wound up selecting the most sour clergy person you could find on the entire West Coast to be our vicar for about 3 years. And you'd like to think that it was kind of an uncomfortable relationship. He goes on writing these really pointed messages to the vestry and to the clerk and to the diocese and to the congregation for his entire tenure here. And he says, frankly, the problem, this is again 1936, we've been here for 40-something years. He says, the problem with you people is you don't want to talk about money. And it's time you talked about the money. And he finally gets that kind of reporting done, where there is a, I think that's when we started a gift register where we started recording the donations that people made and for what purpose. We start publishing how we're doing financially. He really starts to get the place on a good footing, and surprisingly, he's also able to increase attendance by something like 50%. So by the end of his tenure here, we're up to about 200 people showing up every Sunday. It's pretty good for a real kind of a nasty guy, it sounds like. But so he hands off the ball to this guy, Russell Staines, who continues to grow participation. And you start to see St. Mary's be able to take on things like outreach efforts and missionary work, growing music ministry, growing things like a men's group or youth ministry, those types of things. But only after we've swallowed this bitter pill of being able to talk about the money. So Russell Staines is here for about 3 years, and then comes Keppel Hill. And he recognizes by this time the place is physically falling apart again. They have a building fund that is grossly underfunded for what's happening here, and they want to build a parish hall. This is what becomes this building, as well as acquire the building that's now Pixley Hall. So we're grossly underfunded for all of those things. We're falling behind in terms of the physical plant, and just there's a lot more to be done than we're capable of doing. Keppel Hill, if you go through the records, again, it says it doesn't show up in the blue, but it shows up in the paperwork, goes out and finds all these, I want to say, lapsed Episcopalians in the neighborhood, and spends about 3 years writing letters to the bishop and saying these people really need to be reinitiated or recommunicated with the church. People who have gone through 3 and 4 divorces, in one case a woman who was in a bigamous relationship, and he was able to get, pardon? Had been in a bigamous relationship. But Keppel Hill manages to really walk the walk and get these people in the door and pledging. And along the way, picking up some really important people in the parish. One was Martin Debenham, a name that maybe is known to a lot of you. Warren Debenham, his son, he was a doctor, lived over around the corner here, and Warren Debenham, his son, was ordained from St. Mary's, and I think is recently retired, if I'm not mistaken. Is he still preaching?
Maybe it's familiar.
Oh, really? Okay. Anyway, from the neighborhood, and Keppel Hill it really brings a lot of life to the parish. If you read the book, he sounds kind of self-aggrandizing, like he's really trying to say, I made this place what it is. But the fact is that he really had a lot of faith in what the place could be, and he tried a lot of things that didn't work. For example, like youth ministry or ministries to young unmarried people, these kinds of things that we still try to make stick. They go for a little while and then they might peter out. And he really comes up with a kind of a formula for how this place has to work. He says the product has to be really good. The music, the worship, the liturgy, the sermons. Because on any given Sunday, as many as half of the people in the pews, at least at that time, are visitors. You can't assume that they're coming back again. And he says the only reason they're going to come back is if they get a good show and a really good feeling about the place. So it's the first time in all of those records where you really see somebody say, here's who we are and where we are and what we have to do to make it work. Now, beneath all of that is always this aspiration of building, the parochial community of Cow Hollow. But we're all here, we've seen it, and it's not an easy job. I want to point out, again, a couple of the times that we've been hanging by a thread, particularly in the 1920s and 30s. The rectors at that time really were reduced to not making very much money. As you can see that Reverend Jones's letter talking about how you really have to pay them, or they're not going to stay, or you're not going to get very good ones. At that very time, the vestry and the rectors would go out into the neighborhood and just try to recruit door to door and find people who had no particular roots in the Episcopalian church or anything like that. And they also, it's pretty apparent they were looking for some deep pockets. So there are people who show up on the rolls in the vestry that are brand new to the whole operation, and they bring kind of a different sense about what it means to serve on the vestry. Some of these names, I don't think any of you are here. One of them, Roger T. Rolfe was the brother of James Rolfe, who was the mayor of San Francisco, governor of California, remember his son Jim Rolfe. Well, he was sitting on, it was a group of brothers were sitting on the C&H sugar fortune. And Roger T. Rolfe lived down here on Pierce Street, not far. And there was this effort to sort of run into Roger Rolfe and suck him in. And they were successful. There are a series of letters in the files from Roger Rolfe, where he sort of helped make up the difference. He helped, just keep us in the black from year to year. And every one of these letters ends with, "Don't think this is an annual event."
Let me just interject and say that every year, St. Mary's receives a check from the Rolfe Endowment.
It's the
So
same.
it is an annual event.
And honestly, it was then too.
Right.
He didn't want anybody to think he was a softy. Well, related to them, Rolfe is everybody remembers Moore Dry Dock. It was what went on to become Kaiser Shipyards in Richmond. Edward Moore was another guy that lived in the neighborhood here. Sometime parishioner, but whenever we needed to pay for something or needed somebody to write a check that we could try to backfill later, Moore was the guy who did it. So there are all these, again, in the correspondence in the financial files, there are all these receipts from Moore Dry Dock for things that they paid for, just fixing the roof, fixing the foundation, just little bits and pieces around here. But they got us through a lot of difficult times. And then we come to the Gantners. I don't know if anybody bought a swimsuit in San Francisco in 1940 something. There was a very famous local textile mill that was famous for swimsuits back in the 1930s, 1940s, run by a firm, Gantner, and I can't remember the other name. Anyway, they lived in the neighborhood, J.O. Gantner. And after introducing the men's topless swimsuit in about 1930, and they struck it rich, and we're sitting on a ton of money here. By 1935, there are 3 Gantners on the vestry. J.O. Gantner Jr. and Vallejo Gantner. And Vallejo Gantner is one of these guys. Vallejo is the youngest scion of the family, 21, aspiring actor in Hollywood, and really just a florid individual. If you look at this list of unusual artwork given to St. Mary's, there's plenty of it that comes from Vallejo Gantner. And he's forever, if you read the correspondence, he's always got like a set of 7-foot candelabra sitting in a warehouse in New York that he loved to get to see. and the responses from the rectors are, yeah, that would be very nice. And in fact, by the time he gets to Bayard Jones tells him, every church is full of artifacts like this, things that are just downright ugly. What we need is actual financial support. Great stuff. Vallejo Gantner lived here in San Francisco until about 1996. But he just sort of disappears from view in the 50s.
Do you need help from me tonight?
But there's a real interesting story that occurred late in the 1940s.
Did you really get ushers?
In the 1940s. Go ahead, yes. Are we almost done?
Yeah, I think it was Vallejo Gantner's firm that made the Pentecost Chapel.
That's correct, yes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, in fact, there was a number of...
The Pentecost, the big one, the very,
Oh, yeah.
With the dogs. There was a story.
Oh.
You know, right?
Yeah, it's white frontal, red Whitsun Day frontal, green Trinity, all,
The white front, that's
all
interesting. That's
Gantner.
almost right
yeah.
Which is worth about 25.
there. At least 35,000,
Yeah.
35,000.
Yeah, there are a couple of things, other things like that aren't on anybody's list. I don't know if we still have the Arian Bible.
Yeah, we need to
We
make
still have the
sure.
Arian Bible. Anyway, this is about 1995. Somebody who really had no affiliation with the church at all had a Bible that was printed in 2 volumes by the Arian Press
It's beautiful.
over here in the Presidio, and it's huge. It's really big, and we had to rebuild the lectern over there to be able to hold it. It was a very inconvenient and awkward thing, and it's really tough to keep a $20,000 Bible on a bookshelf someplace. So I don't even know where it is. I don't want to know, but it's here someplace. Another example of huge generosity with almost no practical application.
It must be his word.
Rotten.
In the 1940s, we're just sort of growing. There's a whole big sense that this is before they've reversed the direction of the church, and before we've built the parish hall. But there's a sense of real momentum building. And in addition to the Gantners, are some names that start showing up in the on the vestry. One of them being Keeler. I don't know if that's a relation to you, but
The rich, I'll find out.
there were there's some very influential Keelers here. And the name that I've been trying to find out more about, Terrell Marcus Redding, who was the junior warden for about 4 years here, and very influential, was part of talking Keppel Hill into taking the job in San Francisco. He's a very persuasive and beloved guy. Died in 1948, very suddenly. And I can find no record of him. We looked up obituaries, and he just disappears from the vestry at some point. But a year later, if you go into the book of gifts to the parish, they're raising money to build a fountain in the courtyard in Terrell Hill's honor. So if you ever get a chance, if you look on the tiles on the front of that fountain, you can just barely make out in honor of Terrell Marcus Redding. His nickname was Deke, which I'm assuming his friends called him, because we didn't have any deacons at that time. But in honor of his service to the church, we raised the single largest community offering ever to build that fountain. And it makes you want to know more about the guy, because he obviously was very important to the place and very influential and very faithful and really just bent over backwards for this place, and people loved him.
If anybody has ideas about how to, I would.
Yeah, it's a strange story. You would think that they have a lot. I haven't found any bulletins or anything about it. He's just, there's a notice in a series of vestry meetings, after Deke Redding's sudden death, we hereby appoint so-and-so to fill his position. That's about it. Finally, to bring things up to date, I think it's worth talking about Pogek Lowe, who was another example of somebody with tremendous faith here, and that almost nobody knew. And who remembers Pogek Lowe? Not too many. But she was a very shy and unassuming person, always impeccably dressed, really polite, and very thoughtful person. But upon her death, she left 2 bequests to the church. One, when she was on her deathbed, visited by members of the clergy, and then again after her death. And her bequest is what winds up being used to redecorate what is now the library, the lounge. I always call it the Pogek Lowe study, right? And I don't know, I love to think about people like that, and like Deke Redding, who really gave a lot of themselves without asking for much or expecting any kind of recognition. That's what makes the place go.
And she was actually.
She was
She was in the Stevens Ministry Cathedral before she came here, and then we worked with her at Raphael House. I don't know how people.
Yeah, I
maybe.
think I cooked with her around
Yeah.
the house once.
Yeah, she was a lovely person.
So, amongst the Moors and all the big givers are these people who just kind of get it done from week to week, selling cookies or just keeping it together. David?
I just wanted to thank God that you didn't write the section on the church facility for the parish profile for the search committee. And I think we would have had people staying away in droves.
Well, they were at one time. They actually attributed the decline in attendance to the decline in the building. You could smell it. They said you could just smell it. And there are photographs in the archives here of like the last really big capital projects that we undertook, which was I think 1990 something.
Right, for the renovation of here.
Right.
Here,
And then, but then there was this big,
wall and.
right. And then there was the big one in 1948, and there were little ones in between there.
And we actually were meeting at the Presidio. We took over the officers club for several years.
But in there are,
at that time.
in amongst all of that are photographs of, like for example, opening up the crypt under the floor of the church there, where they open it up and there's water running through there, and amongst the coffee cans and urns full of cremated remains. Or underneath the church in the crawl space there, still, that stream's still running, and it's an ongoing thing. I think our last adventure was, what, about 3 months ago, after the big rains, when the courtyard was underwater. So we're still, we're still in there.
Be careful where you walk.
Any other questions?
Sandy, just a couple of thoughts. First of all, your presentation this morning was fabulous, and I hope, are we getting, is it recorded at all? It would be nice to have it as part of our living history.
Yeah.
Sure.
And make it part of our archives in terms of our history.
It'd be nice to share with the new rector too.
After he signed up.
For a month or two.
But the second thought, and this is kind of to Reverend Paula's point in her sermon several weeks ago about how we're being called to preserve the spiritual capital of our faith over the years, over 2,000 years. I think the same statement can be made about how we're being called as a parish to preserve the physical plant, to preserve all of the gifts that St. Mary's as a faith community has given to the world and to the members of the parish, but to continue that in the future. I mean, it's a spiritual capital, but it's also physical capital, and perhaps, Paula, when you were talking about that, when you talked about spiritual capital, the idea of preserving this parish going into the future is part of that, don't you think?
There's something I didn't want to conclude from reading the book and going through the records is that there's a direct, I wouldn't say direct correlation, but a relationship between the tenure of the rector and the degree of commitment that we see from the congregation and the growth of the congregation. So the longer a rector is here, the more we get done and the more people get involved. It's just the way it's worked here. I don't know if that's a goal. So I think the stability, the known product, the fact that people are comfortable inviting friends to come in, that all pays off. And it's almost directly related to the length of time that somebody's here. Richard Fowler was 33 years. And his legacy continues in a lot of what we just do day to day. The next longest one was Keppel Hill. And he saw what was difficult about being in Cow Hollow and tried to adjust the culture of the church to Cow Hollow. And Jason Parkin, who really emphasized this as a family. We were on the map as the place to take your known family.
And he was here for 8 years.
11.
11.
Yeah. Kind of illustrating that, part of what I've been talking about here is that this is a letter that Chris Ball sent to Jason Parkin after doing a similar project to what I just did, going through the archives. And what Chris found was the record of when we finally paid off the mortgage on the church and were able to get out from underneath any sort of long-term financial commitments. Is it okay if I read it? Okay. This is, Chris was just finishing his tenure as senior warden.
What year?
2002. As I conclude this year of service, I've searched for some way to convey my gratitude for the opportunity to serve. In doing that, I reflected on that day in 1926 when the owners of the land on which this church now sits conveyed the property to St. Mary's. And that was the surviving sisters of Amelia Pixley. One of the many joys and benefits of serving as senior warden is the opportunity to dig into church records to learn a little about the history of this place. Last spring we found, locked away in our safe deposit box, the one-page deed dated April 12, 1926, that reflects the transfer of this property from 3 women, Vera Pixley, May Curtis, and Cornelia Knowles, in exchange for a $10 gold piece. In effect, they gave this property to St. Mary's so that others could worship. I've been struck by the symbolism of that act. 3 wise women bearing a gift that would provide shelter to the struggling St. Mary the Virgin. I've often thought it would be nice to know what happened to that gold piece, to use it to commemorate that generous gift, and to remind us all of how so little can create so much. Alas, I found no ancestors of those wise ladies with knowledge of this event or the whereabouts of the gold coin. But I did find a $10 gold piece stamped 1926, the year of the transfer. Jason, I want you and St. Mary's to have this, so that on those occasions, when the vestry is in despair about our finances, they can pick up this coin and remember that although there may be times when dollars are short and finances are tight, love, generosity, and God's hand will see us through. Thank you all. And this is the 1926 gold piece. And this has been hanging on the rector's office. So anyway, thank you, Chris. I'm really glad it. I'm not sure what our policy is about going through the archives, because it's all very, 70-year-old onion-skin paper, and it just falls apart like that. But it's really, at some point, it'd be really nice to be able to scan it all and have everyone to look at it, because it's hilarious.
For the people who don't know about the reorientation of the entry to the church, can you talk a little bit about
Yeah,
that?
1948.
And why it happened?
It was that there was the original frontage of the church was right on Steiner Street. You walk in, and the altar was at this end of the church. In 1948 was the first really big capital campaign that we undertook, and it included building this building here, which goes on to become Fowler Hall. At that time, it was decided to reverse the orientation of the church such that you're facing east for worship. The crypt that was originally right under the altar then finds itself under the aisle. As to why we did that, I'm not fully sure. I'm not sure. It was, because they wanted to, that was called the atrium at the time, I'm not sure why, but they wanted to enliven the atrium. But also you had to enter the church via stairways off the Steiner, and it was about 8 or 9 steps up, and I'm sure that was long before ADA, but sure it was not an easy thing. So by having the church hall here, the parish hall, and the chapel there, everything sort of fronts on the courtyard.
Was there always a courtyard?
No. No, if you go back to 1926, this was a vacant lot here, and including this building. And it took a long time, actually. There was, I think, a small apartment building built, and I'm not sure, I think that may have come down in a subsequent earthquake after 1906.